The screaming started at 0300 hours. I jerked awake in my bunk, cold sweat already beading on my forehead, as that inhuman shriek echoed through the barracks walls. 20 years old, and 3 months into my service at Camp Lejeune, I'd heard plenty of sounds that would make civilians wet themselves. But this was different. This was wrong in ways that made my skin crawl and my stomach churn with primal terror. "What the hell was that?" Private Messner whispered from the bunk next to mine. Francis Messner from Ohio. My best friend since basic training. The guy who'd shared his last cigarette with me during our first week of hell. His voice shook in the darkness, and hearing fear from someone as tough as Danny made everything infinitely worse. The scream came again, longer this time, stretching out like fingernails on a chalkboard mixed with the dying wail of a wounded animal. But underneath it, I swear I heard something that chilled my blood. Intelligence. Purpose. Rage. Movement! Everyone up! Now! Sergeant Waters' voice boomed through the barracks as the lights snapped on, flooding our eyes with harsh fluorescent reality. Waters was a 20-year veteran, a man who'd seen action in Vietnam and carried himself like he could stare down the devil himself. But even he looked rattled as he stood in the doorway, his usual granite composure cracked around the edges. We scrambled into our utilities, muscle memory taking over as our minds struggled to process what was happening. Outside, I could hear vehicles, lots of them, and the heavy footsteps of personnel moving with urgent precision. Emergency lights strobed through the windows, painting everything in sick red and white flashes. "Sir, what's the situation?" I asked, lacing up my boots with hands that trembled slightly. Waters' jaw worked silently for a moment before he answered. "Chemical leak in the water supply. Base is under full containment protocol. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out until the CBRN specialists give us the all clear." CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear. The 4 horsemen of modern warfare, and now they were loose on our own base. I felt my throat go dry as the implications hit me. How long had we been drinking contaminated water? What kind of chemicals were we talking about? "How bad is it, Sergeant?" Messner asked, echoing the question we all wanted answered. "Bad enough that we've got hazmat teams rolling in from Quantico and the CDC sending their own people down from Atlanta," Morrison replied grimly. "Word is we might be here for weeks." The next few hours blurred together in a haze of confusion and mounting dread. We were herded into the mess hall with the rest of our company, where anxious Marines clustered in groups, trading rumors and speculation. The official word was minimal. Industrial solvents had leaked into our water supply, creating a potential health hazard that required extensive decontamination procedures. But the unofficial word was far more disturbing. "I heard Hauser from 2nd Platoon talking to his buddy in communications," whispered Private Bowens, leaning in close to our little circle. "Says there's been radio chatter about some kind of medical emergency. Multiple casualties, all classified above our pay grade." "Casualties from contaminated water?" Messner frowned. "Doesn't make sense. We'd all be sick by now if it was that bad." I was about to agree when Dr. Lake entered the mess hall. I'd never seen the man before, but everything about him screamed government scientist. The kind of pale, thin figure you'd expect to find in a laboratory rather than a Marine base. He wore civilian clothes under his military-issued jacket, and his eyes held that cold, calculating look of someone who viewed the world as one big experiment. "Gentlemen," Dr. Lake's voice carried easily through the mess hall despite its soft tone. "I know this situation is concerning, but I want to assure you that everything is under control. As a precautionary measure, we'll be administering preventive treatments to all personnel who may have been exposed to the contaminated water supply." He gestured to a team of medics who'd filed in behind him, carrying metal cases that looked more like military equipment than medical supplies. "The treatment is a simple injection that will help your body process and eliminate any toxins you may have ingested. It's completely safe and has been thoroughly tested by the Department of Defense." Something about his tone made my skin crawl. The way he said thoroughly tested with just a hint of satisfaction, like he was particularly proud of that testing. And the way his eyes swept over us, not with the concern of a doctor for his patients, but with the detached interest of a scientist examining lab rats. "Form lines by platoon," Sergeant Waters barked. "First platoon, you're up." We shuffled forward like cattle, and I found myself standing behind Messner as we approached the medical station. The medic, if that's what he really was, prepared the injection with practiced efficiency. The syringe was larger than what I'd expected for a simple treatment, filled with a cloudy greenish fluid that seemed to shift and swirl even when held perfectly still. "Next," the medic called out in a bored voice. Messner stepped up, rolling up his sleeve without question. The needle went in smooth and easy, but I watched my friend's face as the contents emptied into his bloodstream. For just a moment his expression went blank, almost peaceful. Then his pupils dilated slightly, and when he looked back at me, something fundamental had changed in his eyes. "How do you feel?" the medic asked, making a note on his clipboard. "Fine," Messner replied, but his voice had a strange, distant quality. "Better than fine, actually. Clear. Focused." The medic nodded with satisfaction. "Excellent. Please report to the designated observation area and remain there until further notice." Then it was my turn. The needle slid into my arm before I could change my mind, and immediately I felt something foreign coursing through my veins. It wasn't pain exactly, but it wasn't natural either. Like ice water mixed with electricity, spreading through my system and settling into my bones with an uncomfortable tingling sensation. "Any immediate side effects?" the medic asked, watching me with clinical interest. "No, sir," I lied. Because admitting that I felt like something alien was rewiring my nervous system seemed like a very bad idea. For the next 6 hours, we sat in what they called the observation area. Really just the base gymnasium with all the equipment pushed against the walls. Most of the guys seemed normal enough, talking quietly or playing cards to pass the time. But I noticed things. Small things that probably shouldn't have bothered me as much as they did. Messner wasn't blinking as often as he should. Bowens kept flexing his fingers like he was testing their strength, and Private Gianni from 3rd Platoon had developed a slight tremor in his left hand that he kept trying to hide. But the worst part was the sound. Every hour or so, that inhuman screaming would echo through the base again. Sometimes single voices, sometimes multiple voices joining in a chorus of agony that made everyone in the gymnasium fall silent and exchange worried glances. The guards at the doors, men in full hazmat gear, would tense up each time it happened, their hands moving instinctively to their weapons. "Sergeant Waters," I called out when he passed by our group. "Sir, what's making those sounds?" Waters stopped, and for a moment I saw raw fear flicker across his weathered features. "Complications from the chemical exposure," he said finally. "Some personnel are experiencing more severe reactions than others." But I could tell he was lying. We all could. As night fell and the base settled into an uneasy quiet, I found myself staring at the ceiling and listening to the subtle changes in the men around me. Breathing patterns that weren't quite right. Soft muttering in languages that didn't exist. And underneath it all, a growing sense that whatever they'd injected into us wasn't medicine at all. It was something else entirely. The real horror began just after midnight, when Messner started convulsing. Not the clean medical convulsions you see in movies. This was something raw and violent and wrong. His back arched impossibly high, his limbs flailing with superhuman strength as foam poured from his mouth. But it was his eyes that will haunt me forever. Because even as his body writhed in agony, his eyes remained perfectly aware, perfectly intelligent, and filled with an accusation that cut straight to my soul. He was still looking at me when his skin started to bubble and melt. The thing that had been Francis Messner let out another shriek as its flesh continued to bubble and reform. Bones cracking and extending through skin that looked like melted plastic. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. This wasn't death. This was transformation into something that violated every natural law I'd ever known. "Everyone stay back," Sergeant Waters roared, but his voice cracked with barely contained panic. Around the gymnasium, other Marines were beginning to convulse, their bodies seizing as the same horrific metamorphosis took hold. The air filled with the wet sounds of flesh reshaping itself and the grinding of bones breaking and reforming. What had been Messner's face split open vertically, revealing rows of teeth where his cheekbones should have been. His left eye migrated to his forehead while his right eye simply multiplied, becoming a cluster of smaller eyes that blinked in different patterns. His arms stretched and twisted, fingers fusing and separating until they resembled gnarled tree branches ending in needle-sharp points. But the worst part was that he was still conscious, still aware. When those clustered eyes focused on me, I saw recognition there, and rage so pure it made my blood freeze. "Matthew!" The thing that was Messner gurgled, its voice coming from multiple mouths that had opened along its torso. "Why didn't you stop them?" Before I could answer, the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a second later, bathing everything in hellish red light just as the first crack of thunder shook the building. But this wasn't ordinary thunder. It was a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, deep and resonant and wrong in ways that made your teeth ache. "What the hell?" Private Bowens gasped, pressing himself against the wall as more Marines began their agonizing transformations around us. Through the gymnasium windows, I could see trees bending at impossible angles, their trunks nearly horizontal, as wind howled with the fury of a Category 5 hurricane. The storm had come out of nowhere. 20 minutes ago, the night had been clear and still. Now it sounded like the world was ending outside, with winds that shrieked louder than the transforming Marines and rain that hammered the building like machine gun fire. That's when I saw Dr. Lake standing calmly in the corner, clipboard in hand, taking notes as if he was observing lab rats instead of watching human beings transform into nightmarish abominations. His face showed no horror, no surprise, only clinical interest and what looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "You knew this would happen," I accused, having to scream to be heard over the storm and the inhuman sounds of transformation. "You knew exactly what that injection would do." Dr. Lake looked up from his notes, and for the first time since I'd met him, he smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Of course I knew, Private Bernard. This is precisely what was supposed to happen. The serum has a 12-hour incubation period before full activation." 12 hours? Bowen stared at him in horror. "You've been watching us for 12 hours, knowing this would happen?" "The storm is merely unfortunate timing," Dr. Lake replied, glancing at the windows as another crack of thunder shook the building. "Though I must admit, it does add a certain dramatic flair to the proceedings." The thing that had been Messner lunged at me with inhuman speed, its needle fingers slashing through the air where my head had been a split second before. I rolled to the side, coming up in a crouch as more transformed Marines began stumbling and lurching toward the handful of us who remained unchanged. These weren't coordinated predators. They were something far more terrifying. Confused, enraged creatures driven by pain and a primal hunger for violence. They moved erratically, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, colliding with each other and the walls as they tried to process their new forms. But unchanged, for how much longer? I could feel that tingling sensation in my veins growing stronger, spreading through my nervous system like liquid fire. How long before I became one of those grotesque horrors? "The armory!" Sergeant Waters bellowed, drawing his sidearm and putting 2 rounds into the center mass of a creature that had once been Private Gianni. The bullets punched through its malleable flesh without slowing it down. The thing let out a shriek of rage and pain but kept coming, its elongated arms reaching for Waters with desperate hunger. "We need real firepower." Waters fired 3 more rounds, this time aiming for what remained of the creature's head. The shots found their mark, and Gianni's transformed body finally collapsed in a twitching heap. But the gunfire had attracted the attention of every other creature in the gymnasium, and they began converging on our position with jerky, unnatural movements. The armory was 3 buildings away, across an open courtyard that was now being lashed by winds strong enough to turn debris into deadly projectiles. But it was our only chance. The transformed Marines weren't just mindless monsters. They were hunting us with disturbing intelligence, coordinating their movements like a pack of predators. "Move! Stay together!" Waters kicked open the emergency exit, and we burst into the chaos of the storm. The wind hit us like a physical blow, driving rain so hard it felt like being sandblasted. Lightning split the sky in patterns that hurt to look at directly, illuminating a base that had transformed into something from a fever dream. Buildings swayed and groaned under the assault, while debris flew through the air with lethal velocity. But it wasn't the storm that made me stumble in horror. It was what I saw moving between the buildings. More creatures. Dozens of them, emerging from barracks and administrative buildings across the base. But these weren't moving in any kind of formation or pattern. These were fused abominations, Multiple human bodies partially merged together into writhing masses of flesh and bone that moved with horrible, uncontrolled spasms. I watched in sick fascination as one cluster of 3 fused Marines dragged itself across the courtyard, using arms that emerged from unexpected angles, while multiple faces screamed from different parts of its body. The creature seemed to be fighting itself, different parts trying to move in different directions. Another horror appeared to be 2 Marines who had melted together at the torso, creating a 2-headed, 4-armed thing that stumbled and fell repeatedly, unable to coordinate its movements. "Jesus Christ," Bowens whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "How many people were on this base?" 2,000 Marines, Waters replied grimly, checking his weapon. "Plus civilian personnel and the research staff." 2,000. If even half of them had received the injection, we were looking at a small army of these abominations, and they were all between us and any hope of escape. We made it halfway to the armory before the first sniper round cracked past my head. "Down! Down!" Waters threw himself behind an overturned vehicle, dragging Bowens with him. I dove behind a concrete barrier, feeling the bite of gravel against my face as another round sparked off the pavement inches from where I'd been standing. "Where's it coming from?" I shouted, trying to spot the muzzle flash in the chaos of the storm. "Watchtower!" Bowens pointed to a guard tower at the perimeter of the base, barely visible through the driving rain. "They've got shooters positioned around the entire containment zone." It made horrible sense. Whatever this experiment was, they weren't going to let anyone leave to tell the world about it. We were trapped between the transformed Marines hunting us from within and government snipers keeping us contained. The storm provided perfect cover for both threats. As if to prove the point, I heard someone screaming through the rain, a human voice, not one of the transformed abominations. About 50 yards away, I could see a figure running desperately toward the perimeter fence. It was Private Johnson from 3rd Platoon, still in his normal human form, apparently trying to escape the base. He made it maybe 20 yards before the sniper round took him center mass. Johnson spun and fell, his body convulsing in the mud as blood mixed with rainwater. He tried to crawl forward, still attempting to reach the fence, but a second shot to the head ended his struggle. "Jesus," Bowens whispered. "They're killing everyone, even the ones who aren't transformed." "No witnesses," I said grimly, just like Dr. Lake said. Another survivor, I couldn't tell who from this distance, broke cover from a different building, sprinting toward a gap in the perimeter. The sniper fire came immediately, multiple muzzle flashes from different positions around the base. The runner made it maybe 15 feet before being cut down by crossfire. "How do we get to the armory?" I called out as another sniper round punched through the metal of our makeshift cover. "We don't," Waters replied flatly. "Not across open ground with shooters covering every approach." But even as he said it, I spotted movement from the direction of the armory. A group of figures was emerging from the building, moving erratically through the storm. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Other survivors, maybe even a rescue team. Then lightning illuminated them clearly, and I saw the truth. More transformed Marines, their bodies grotesquely modified, stumbling and lurching toward us. They moved with pure animal aggression, their mutated limbs and protruding bones serving as natural weapons. Behind them, I could see the armory building, its doors blown wide open, with military equipment scattered everywhere as if something had torn through it in a frenzy. "The armory's been hit," Waters growled, putting down another creature that had gotten too close with his sidearm. "But look at all that equipment just lying there." "Then we fight our way through," I said, checking my own sidearm. 15 rounds left, not nearly enough. "With what?" Bowens gestured to the chaos around us. "There's gotta be 50 of those things between us and any real weapons." "Look!" Waters pointed toward the damaged armory building. "The doors are blown open. Those creatures must have rampaged through there. There's equipment scattered all over the place." He was right. The transformed Marines had torn through the armory like a tornado, their violent thrashing and mindless aggression destroying everything in their path. Heavy weapons, ammunition crates, even what looked like grenades were scattered across the courtyard, abandoned and forgotten as the creatures moved on to hunt for prey. They don't want the weapons, I realized, watching as one creature completely ignored an M16 lying at its feet, instead slashing at the air with bone spurs that had grown from its forearms. They only care about killing with their own mutated bodies. If we can get to that equipment, Bowen said hopefully, we'd have a fighting chance, I finished. But between us and those weapons were at least a dozen grotesque abominations, all of them turning their attention toward us as they sensed living prey. Dr. Lake's voice came from behind us, and I spun to see him standing calmly in the storm, as if the hurricane-force winds weren't even touching him. The experiment was designed to enhance human capabilities, but the results were more dramatic than anticipated. "You're insane," Bowen snarled, raising his sidearm toward the scientist. Dr. Lake tilted his head with that same clinical interest. "Am I? We've created beings with enhanced strength and reduced susceptibility to pain. The physical modifications were unexpected, but fascinating from a research perspective. You've turned them into monsters." I stared at him in disbelief. "Failed experiments," Dr. Lake corrected. "The serum was supposed to enhance cognitive and physical capabilities while maintaining human form. Instead, it triggered uncontrolled cellular mutation. Disappointing, really." The transformed creatures from the armory were getting closer, stumbling through the storm while dragging various weapons and equipment. They moved without coordination, some bumping into each other, others falling and struggling to get back up. One creature tried to fire an M16 but couldn't figure out how to operate it with its mutated hands. That's when Sergeant Waters put 3 rounds center mass into Dr. Lake. The scientist staggered but didn't fall. Instead, he looked down at the spreading bloodstains on his shirt with mild curiosity, then back at us with that same cold smile. "Did you really think I would design a weapon without ensuring my own protection?" Dr. Lake asked, his wounds already beginning to close. "I was the first test subject, gentlemen. The prototype." His face began to shift and change, skin rippling as bone structure realigned beneath it. Additional sensory organs emerged along his temples while his fingers extended into razor-sharp claws. But unlike the other transformations, this one was controlled, refined, purposeful. "I've had months to perfect the process," he continued, his voice now coming from multiple vocal cords. "While my subjects received crude, unstable versions of the serum, I've been refining myself into something far more advanced. The containment protocol isn't to keep the contamination in," I realized with growing horror. "It's to keep witnesses from getting out." Dr. Lake nodded approvingly. "Very good. Yes, this entire experiment must remain classified. The subjects were never meant to survive the testing phase." That's when Sergeant Waters put 3 rounds center mass into Dr. Lake. The scientist staggered but didn't fall. Instead, he looked down at the spreading bloodstains on his shirt with mild curiosity, then back at us with that same cold smile. "Did you really think I would design a serum without testing it on myself first?" Dr. Lake asked, his wounds already beginning to close. "I received a refined version, one that maintains intelligence and human appearance while providing enhanced durability." His face began to shift slightly, skin taking on a waxy, artificial appearance as the bullet wounds sealed themselves. Unlike the other transformations, this one was subtle, controlled, the work of someone who had perfected the process through careful experimentation. "I've had months to refine the formula on myself," he continued. "While my subjects received crude, unstable versions, I've achieved the perfect balance of enhancement and control." A scream from behind us made me spin around. 3 more Marines were beginning their transformation, their bodies convulsing as bones cracked and reformed. One of them, Private Martinez from 2nd Platoon, was reaching toward us with desperate, pleading eyes as his jaw began to split and multiply. "Help! Me!" he gasped before his voice box restructured itself into something inhuman. "We need to move now!" Waters barked, emptying his clip into an approaching creature that had once been a supply sergeant. The thing stumbled, but kept coming, black blood oozing from its wounds. I grabbed a combat knife from Martinez's belt before his transformation could complete, then turned toward the armory. If we can't go around them, we go through them. The closest creature, a fused mass of 2 Marines that moved like a grotesque spider, lunged at me with surprising speed. I ducked under its reaching arms and drove the knife deep into what I hoped was a vital area. The blade sank into soft, malleable flesh, and the thing shrieked in pain and rage, but it didn't die. Instead, it grabbed me with one of its many arms, lifting me off the ground with impossible strength. I could smell the stench of rotting meat and chemicals as multiple mouths opened across its surface, each one screaming a different tone of anguish. Bowens opened fire with his sidearm, putting round after round into the creature's center mass. The bullets had little effect on its mutated physiology, but the impacts were enough to make it drop me. I hit the ground hard, rolling away as more transformed Marines stumbled toward us through the driving rain. The equipment shed. Waters pointed to a smaller building between us and the scattered weapons. There might be maintenance tools we can use to clear a path. We fought our way across the first stretch of courtyard, using knives and the few remaining bullets we had to keep the creatures at bay. The storm provided some cover, the howling wind and driving rain making it hard for the transformed Marines to track us. But there were so many of them now, emerging from every building on the base. The shed was unlocked, and inside we found what we were looking for. Crowbars, sledgehammers, even a chainsaw used for clearing fallen trees. Tools that could do real damage to these abominations. Now we're talking. Bowens hefted a pickaxe, testing its weight. I grabbed the chainsaw and checked the fuel, nearly full. The engine roared to life on the third pull, and the sound seemed to drive the nearby creatures into a frenzy. But now we had the tools to fight back. The first creature through the shed door lost its head to Waters' sledgehammer. The second took my chainsaw across its midsection, spraying black blood and chunks of mutated flesh across the walls. These things might be strong and resistant to bullets, but they could still be torn apart with enough brute force. "We make for that scattered equipment," Waters shouted over the chainsaw's roar. "Get to that M60 and we can clear out this whole courtyard." We burst from the shed like men possessed, cutting through the transformed Marines with savage efficiency. My chainsaw tore through mutated flesh and bone while Bowen's pickaxe crushed skulls, and Waters' sledgehammer shattered spines. The creatures fought back with their own natural weapons, bone spurs that shot from their arms, elongated claws, and teeth that had multiplied into shark-like rows. But they were clumsy and uncoordinated. I reached a scattered M60 first, abandoning the chainsaw as I hefted the heavy machine gun. The weapon lay amid a pile of other military equipment that had been strewn about by the creature's rampage through the armory. A nearby abomination, a twisted thing with spine-like protrusions covering its entire body, tried to slash at me with razor-sharp bone growths. Waters put his sledgehammer through its skull before it could reach me. "Ammo!" I yelled, spotting the ammunition boxes scattered around like debris. Bowens was already on it, dragging a belt of .308 rounds toward me while keeping creatures at bay with his pickaxe. The M60 came alive in my hands, spitting fire and death into the crowd of abominations. The heavy rounds tore through their mutated flesh like tissue paper, finally giving us a weapon that could put these things down permanently. Bodies exploded in showers of black blood and gore as the machine gun chewed through their ranks. "There!" Waters pointed to another cluster of abandoned weapons. M16s and what looks like a grenade launcher. Bowens made a dash for the rifles while I provided covering fire with the M60. The creatures showed no interest in the weapons whatsoever. They were entirely focused on tearing us apart with their own mutated appendages. One creature tried to impale me with a bone spear that had grown from its shoulder, but the .308 rounds shredded it before it could get close. "Got him!" Bowens called out, slinging two M16s over his shoulder and grabbing the grenade launcher. Full magazines. Now we had real firepower. The creatures had inadvertently armed us by destroying the armory and scattering its contents. I continued laying down suppressing fire with the machine gun while Waters and Bowens picked up the assault rifles. The tide of battle had completely turned. Instead of running from these horrors, we were systematically hunting them down and destroying them. "The armory itself might have more inside," Waters shouted, pointing to the building that had been ransacked. Those things only cared about finding people to kill, not destroying the deeper storage. He was right. The transformed Marines had torn through the front of the armory in their mindless hunt for prey, but they had no interest in weapons or ammunition. Most of the arsenal was probably still intact deeper inside the building, but I could feel the serum in my own bloodstream responding to the violence, the tingling sensation growing stronger with each creature we destroyed. For a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of what these things experienced. The pain, the confusion, the rage at what had been done to them. And underneath it all, I could feel my own body beginning to change. "Go to hell," I snarled at the next creature that charged us, and brought the chainsaw down in a spray of gore and fury. The storm raged overhead as we fought our way through the nightmare, but I could feel time running out with every heartbeat. The serum was winning, my body was changing, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice whispered that maybe it would be easier to just give in, but not yet. I was still human. For now. The hurricane hit with biblical fury at exactly 0347 hours. What had been a violent storm became something else entirely, a force of nature so devastating that it turned the base into ground zero of what the meteorologists would later call an unprecedented weather event. The wind shifted from a howling 90 miles per hour to something that defied measurement, and I watched in terrified awe as entire buildings began to lift from their foundations. We had been making our final push toward the armory's interior when the eye wall struck. Waters, Bowens, and I had just cleared the last cluster of abominations from the courtyard with our liberated firepower when the world exploded around us. "Get inside!" Waters screamed, but his voice was instantly swallowed by a roar that sounded like the earth itself was being torn apart. I saw him grab Bowens by the shoulder, pulling him toward the armory entrance as debris the size of cars began flying through the air like leaves. That's when we saw it, and the thing that emerged from the ruins of the main barracks wasn't like the other creatures. This was something that had once been multiple Marines, maybe 6 or 7 of them, fused into a single massive abomination that stood nearly 12 feet tall. Its surface writhed with faces and limbs from its component parts, each one screaming in a different key to create a harmony of pure agony. Bone spikes jutted from every surface like a porcupine made of human remains, and it moved with the inexorable purpose of a living bulldozer. But even this monstrosity was nothing compared to the hurricane. The creature took 3 steps toward us before a wall of wind hit it like the fist of God. I watched in stunned silence as this thing, this horror that had shrugged off machine gun fire, was lifted bodily into the air and hurled against the side of a building with enough force to crater the concrete. "Matthew!" Bowen screamed, reaching toward me as the wind began to lift him off his feet. "Help me!" I lunged forward, grabbing his outstretched hand just as Waters wrapped his arms around a steel support beam. For a moment, the 3 of us formed a human chain against the fury of nature. But the hurricane wasn't interested in our courage or our determination. The roof of the armory peeled away above us like the lid of a sardine can. Through the opening, I could see the eye of the storm, a perfect circle of calm surrounded by walls of wind and rain that reached up into the darkness like the inside of some cosmic tornado. Lightning flickered constantly within those walls, illuminating glimpses of debris, vehicles, and what might have been pieces of the base itself spinning in endless, deadly circles. "I can't hold on!" Bowen shouted, his grip on my hand beginning to slip. The wind was pulling at him with the strength of a dozen men, and I could feel my own feet beginning to slide across the wet concrete. That's when the massive creature, the fused abomination, came crashing back down. It landed directly on Sergeant Waters. The impact was instant and final. Waters simply disappeared beneath tons of mutated flesh and bone. I heard no scream, saw no struggle. One moment he was there, the next he was gone. But the creature was hurt now, damaged by its collision with the building, and in its pain it thrashed wildly. One of its massive appendages, something that might have been an arm or a leg or some horrible fusion of both, swept sideways and caught Bowens across the chest. I felt his hand torn from mine as he was launched into the spinning chaos of the storm's eye, his body tumbling end over end until it was lost in the darkness above. I was alone. The creature tried to right itself, multiple mouths opening to roar defiance at the hurricane. But nature had other plans. A second wall of wind, even stronger than the first, picked up the abomination and sent it spinning into the eye of the storm like a grotesque rag doll. I watched it disappear into the maelstrom, its screams joining the voice of the wind, until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And then I felt it. A strange calm settling over me as the storm raged. The serum in my bloodstream, which had been burning and tingling for hours, suddenly went dormant. Not gone. I could still feel its presence like a sleeping serpent in my veins. But quiet, waiting. I realized with crystal clarity that this was my chance. Maybe my only chance. The hurricane had created a corridor of destruction that led directly to the perimeter fence. Buildings had been flattened, creating a clear path where before there had been nothing but obstacles and sniper positions. More importantly, the storm had grounded or destroyed the watchtowers. I could see sparking electrical lines and twisted metal where the guard posts had been. But I had maybe minutes before the eye passed over completely, and the other side of the hurricane hit with equal fury. I ran. Not the careful, not the tactical movement of a Marine under fire, but the desperate sprint of a man with nothing left to lose. The wind grabbed at me, trying to lift me into its deadly embrace, but I stayed low and kept moving. Debris rained down around me. Chunks of concrete, twisted metal, what looked like pieces of military vehicles. But somehow none of it hit me. The fence had been flattened by a falling communications tower. I vaulted over the twisted chain link and kept running, even as the eye wall approached from the opposite side. Behind me, I could hear the base dying, buildings collapsing, vehicles exploding, and underneath it all, the fading screams of whatever creatures had survived the initial onslaught. I made it to the tree line just as the second half of the hurricane struck. For the next 6 hours, I huddled in a drainage ditch while the storm tried to kill everything in a 50-mile radius. Trees fell around me like matchsticks. The ground shook with impacts that might have been buildings or aircraft, or pieces of the base itself. Through it all, I felt the serum in my bloodstream remaining dormant, as if the storm had somehow shocked it into submission. When dawn finally broke, Camp Lejeune was gone. Not damaged, not destroyed. Gone. Where there had once been a Marine base housing 2,000 personnel, there was now nothing but a field of debris and twisted metal scattered across miles of devastated landscape. It looked like a nuclear bomb had gone off, except instead of radiation, there was just the smell of rain and pine sap and something else. Something chemical and wrong that made my throat burn. I never saw another living thing emerge from that wasteland. The official reports came out 3 days later. Hurricane Diana, an unprecedented meteorological event, had struck the North Carolina coast with winds exceeding 200 miles per hour. Camp Lejeune had taken a direct hit, resulting in total base destruction and catastrophic loss of life. All personnel were presumed dead. There were no survivors. They were almost right. I walked for 2 days through the devastated countryside before I found a town that hadn't been completely flattened by the storm. From there, it was easy to disappear. Matthew Bernard, USMC, had died at Camp Lejeune along with everyone else. The young man who had been so excited to serve his country was gone, lost in the wreckage of government lies and experimental horrors. But I survived. Changed, scarred, carrying something dormant in my blood that sometimes stirred in the darkest hours of the night. But I survived. I made my way north, staying off the grid, working cash jobs, and eventually settling in Newark, New Jersey. Far from North Carolina, far from the military, far from anyone who might connect me to the Marine who had supposedly died in that hurricane. For 43 years, I've lived in the same cramped apartment above a bodega on South Orange Avenue, watching the world change while the thing in my veins remained dormant, but never gone. Some nights, I wake up feeling it stirring. A tingling sensation that starts in my fingertips and spreads up my arms, accompanied by dreams of melting flesh and inhuman screams. On those nights, I look in the mirror, and sometimes, just sometimes, I see my reflection flicker. For just a moment, my eyes might be in the wrong place, or my jaw might extend a little too far, or I might count one too many teeth when I force myself to smile. But it always fades by morning. Whatever went wrong with me, whatever made the serum fail to complete its work, has held for over 4 decades. I'm still human. Mostly. I've spent years wondering why I survived when everyone else died. Why the serum didn't transform me like it did Messner and the others. Why I was the only one who escaped that nightmare. I have theories. Maybe it was my blood type. Maybe it was some genetic quirk. Maybe it was just dumb luck. Or maybe the hurricane itself somehow disrupted the process at the critical moment. But I think the real reason I survived wasn't biological. It was purpose. Someone needs to remember what really happened at Camp Lejeune in 1982. Someone needs to tell the truth about Francis Messner and Sergeant Waters and Private Bowens and all the other Marines who died not as heroes in service to their country, but as lab rats in a government experiment gone horribly wrong. The official story is neat and clean. Hurricane Diana destroyed the base and killed everyone on it. A tragic natural disaster, nothing more. The water contamination reports that came out years later only mentioned industrial solvents, chemicals that cause cancer, not the kind of cellular mutation I witnessed that night. They've covered it all up with layers of bureaucracy and classification stamps and the simple passage of time. But I remember the green fluid in those syringes. I remember Dr. Lake standing calmly in the storm as Marines transformed into abominations around him. I remember the sniper's position to kill anyone who tried to escape, and the way Messner's eyes stayed conscious and aware even as his body melted and reformed into something inhuman. I remember my friends dying not in combat, not defending freedom, but as victims of their own government's ambition. They deserved better. They all deserved better. So I'm telling their story now, at 73 years old, with hands that sometimes shake, and eyes that sometimes see things that aren't there. I'm telling it because the thing in my blood is stirring more frequently now, and I don't know how much longer I can keep it dormant. I can feel it wanting to complete what was started that night, to finish the transformation that the hurricane somehow interrupted. Maybe that's why I've lived so long. Maybe I was meant to survive just long enough to tell the truth. The experiments didn't end at Camp Lejeune, you know. I've spent years tracking rumors, following paper trails, connecting dots that the government tried to erase. Different bases, different programs, different names for the same basic research. How do you create the perfect soldier? How do you enhance human capabilities beyond natural limits? They're still trying, still experimenting, still turning young men and women who want to serve their country into test subjects for horrors beyond imagination. But now you know. Now someone else remembers what happened to the Marines of Camp Lejeune in 1982. And maybe, if enough people remember, if enough people ask the right questions, we can stop it from happening again. My name was Matthew Bernard. I was a United States Marine. I was 20 years old when my government used me as a guinea pig, and I'm 73 now, still carrying the scars and the dormant poison they put in my blood. This is my testimony. This is the truth they tried to bury under a hurricane. This is for Francis, for Waters, for Bowens, for all of them. Remember their names. Remember what was done to them. And if you see the signs, if you hear about water contamination at a military base, or experimental programs to enhance soldier capabilities, or any of the other lies they use to cover up their crimes, remember this story. Because somewhere out there, in some other base, in some other program, there are more young Marines who trust their government and want to serve their country. And they have no idea what's coming. The thing in my blood just stirred again. I can feel it moving, testing the barriers that have held it back for 43 years. My reflection in the bathroom mirror this morning showed teeth in places they shouldn't be, just for a moment, before snapping back to normal. I don't have much time left, but I've told the truth. I've honored their memory. That has to be enough.